He said it on a Tuesday, not in anger, not in cruelty. In that particular flat tone he used when he was managing something, the same tone he used to instruct his secretary to dismiss a petition, to close a door that had been left inconveniently open. "You may leave," the Duke of Ashmore told his wife, across the breakfast table, in the 43rd week of their marriage. "The Pemberton cottage in Devon is available. You will be comfortable there. An allowance will be arranged." She looked at him for 3 seconds. Then she folded her napkin with the care of a woman who has been trained since childhood to fold napkins correctly, regardless of what is happening inside her chest. She set it on the table. She stood up. And in the moment she stood, in the precise second, she rose from that chair with her spine straight and her chin level, and not one single word of protest. He understood. For the first time in 43 weeks, what he had done. He had dismissed someone who was irreplaceable. He had done it quietly, at breakfast, on a Tuesday, and she was going to go. Before we begin, kindly click that subscribe button and like this story. Tell me where you are listening from tonight. I want to know. Because this story is about the worst kind of mistake, the kind you make in silence, so quietly you don't even notice you're making it, until the person walks away and the room is very, very empty. Settle in. The year is 1814, and a duke is about to learn what he cannot afford to lose. In Regency England, post-Waterloo society was consumed by the pressure of the marriage market. For a duke without a legitimate heir, marriage was not a personal choice, but a dynastic obligation. Failure to produce an heir could see the title and estates pass to a distant, possibly hostile branch of the family. Under the strict rules of primogeniture, only a son born in lawful wedlock could inherit a dukedom. This meant that a duke's wife was, in the bluntest legal terms, a vessel for succession, her feelings, preferences, and intellectual gifts considered secondary to her reproductive function. The law of coverture dissolved her legal identity entirely upon marriage. She could not own property, enter contracts, or appear in court as an independent party. She was, under English law, her husband's possession. The Duke of Ashmore did not attend his own engagement dinner willingly. He attended it because his solicitor, Mr. Carver, had presented him with a ledger the previous Thursday demonstrating that the Ashmore entail, the legal mechanism binding the estates to male heirs in perpetuity, would pass, upon his death without a legitimate son, to his cousin Reginald, who was 42, unmarried, profligate, and had already expressed intentions for the Ashmore silver collection that made Carver physically ill. He attended the engagement dinner as a man attends a surgical procedure, with the grim resignation of someone who has understood that the alternative is worse. His name was Edmund Voss, 6th Duke of Ashmore, and he was 31 years old and had spent the previous 4 years managing one of the largest estates in Hampshire following his father's death, and had developed in that time a comprehensive relationship with duty that had left very little room for anything else. He was not a man who disliked people. He was a man who had forgotten, somewhere in the machinery of responsibility, how to be with them. The woman across the table was named Cecily Hartwell. She was the 3rd daughter of Viscount Hartwell of Somerset, a family of reasonable lineage, modest fortune, and no social scandals worth mentioning. She had been selected by his mother and his solicitor in a process Edmund had deliberately not examined too closely, on the grounds that examination would require engagement, and engagement would require the expenditure of emotional resources he did not currently possess. She was 24. She had dark auburn hair dressed simply. She wore a gown of pale gold silk that he suspected was either very fashionable or entirely unfashionable. He had not kept current with fashion, and she was seated between his mother and her own father, and was conducting a conversation with his mother about something that was making his mother laugh. His mother did not laugh easily. He noted this. He filed it in the category of things he had noted and not yet examined. He had a large category of this kind. He nodded to Cecily across the table when their eyes met. She returned the nod with the precision of a woman who had made a decision about how she intended to conduct herself and was executing it. There was nothing in her expression that was either hopeful or wounded. She simply looked at him clearly, as one person looks at another when they are trying to determine who they are dealing with. He looked away first. He did not know then that this would become the pattern of their marriage, that she would look at things clearly while he looked away, and that he would spend 43 weeks believing this was a workable arrangement, until the morning it was not. The wedding ceremony of the Church of England, unchanged since 1662, required the bride to vow to love, cherish, and obey. The groom vowed only to love and cherish. The word obey appeared only once in the service, and it was directed at the woman. The physical act of the father giving the bride away, handing her from one man's keeping to another's, was not metaphor. It was a precise enactment of the legal transfer of ownership. She ceased, in the eyes of the law, to be Cecily Hartwell. She became Cecily Voss, a subsidiary of the Duke of Ashmore's legal identity. With no independent existence, the law was required to recognize. They were married on the 14th of June, 1814, at St. George's, Hanover Square, before 60 guests. The ceremony lasted 35 minutes. Edmund said the words with the careful pronunciation of a man who understood that words are instruments and used them accordingly. Cecily said the words differently. She said them as someone who, having decided to do something, intended to do it fully. Her voice was clear and even, and did not falter at the word obey, which he noticed because he had expected it to, because most people, he thought, would find the word difficult. She did not. She simply said it, the way she said everything, and moved on. He thought, in the carriage after the ceremony, that she was either very obedient or very strategic. He would spend the next 12 months discovering that she was neither, and that the word he actually wanted was something he did not yet have vocabulary for. Ashmore House in Mayfair was a house that reflected its owner. Large, well-maintained, functional in every detail, and almost entirely without warmth. The staff were competent and quiet. The rooms were clean and cold. The library, Edmund's retreat and primary habitat, was the only room in the house where any evidence of sustained human occupation was visible. In the form of books with their spines broken and papers distributed across the reading table, in a system that looked chaotic and was, in fact, precise. Cecily arrived at Ashmore House on the afternoon of their wedding day and asked to speak with the housekeeper. Mrs. Denham, 48, experienced, and deeply skeptical of new duchesses on the basis of a previous bad experience, she declined to specify, appeared with the expression of a woman prepared for difficult demands. Cecily asked her, pleasantly and without preamble, for a complete inventory of the household staff, their duties, and the current weekly accounts. Mrs. Denham had not been asked for the accounts by anyone since the previous duchess died 7 years ago. She produced them the following morning. Cecily read them at the breakfast table, with a cup of tea and a small notebook, in which she wrote observations in a handwriting so compact and efficient that Mrs. Denham, who glanced at it sideways, could only read the word irregular and the number 47. Edmund observed this from behind his newspaper. He said nothing. He was not, by nature, a man who asked questions about things that were being managed. Management was good. Management was what he required from a household. He returned to his newspaper. He did not ask what the 47 referred to. If he had asked if, in the first week of his marriage, he had set down his newspaper and said, "What are you finding? Cecily, what are you thinking? What does the 47 mean the next 12 months?" Might have been entirely different. He did not ask. This, too, was a pattern he established, without knowing he was establishing it. By the end of the first week, Cecily had done the following. Identified an overpayment in the linen merchant's account going back 18 months, totaling £47. Negotiated its correction through a quiet letter that did not require Edmund's involvement. Reorganized the morning schedule of the household to eliminate 2 hours of redundant activity between the upper and lower staff. Introduced herself to the cook, the gardener, the groom, the 3 footmen, and the 2 housemaids by their actual names, and learned from each of them one specific thing about how the house functioned in practice rather than theory. She had also done the following. Attended 2 dinners, at which she had been largely silent, because she was learning the terrain. Read 4 of the books in Edmund's library, in the hours between his retiring and her sleeping, because she had nothing else to do and the books were good. written to her mother and her two sisters. Pressed one rose from the garden, which she suspected was very beautiful in season, and was, in October, the color of promise held in reserve. On the 7th day of their marriage, Edmund passed her in the corridor outside the library and said, "I understand. The household is running smoothly." "Yes," she said. He nodded. He went into the library. She stood in the corridor for a moment. Then she went upstairs. It was the longest conversation they had that week. A duchess in Regency England was expected to perform a specific set of social functions: managing the household, representing her husband's interests at social events, receiving and paying calls, supervising the charitable activities associated with the ducal name, and above all, producing the required heir. Her intellectual gifts, if she had them, were considered private rather than public assets. Women were formally excluded from political discourse, legal proceedings, and financial decisions. An intelligent woman in this period found herself in the paradox of being expected to manage enormous complexity. A great house was essentially a small corporation, while being legally prohibited from the instruments that would make that management secure. She did it anyway. They always did. The autumn passed. Then the winter. Cecily, in those months, did things Edmund did not observe, because he was not in the habit of observing. She reorganized the charitable trust attached to the Ashmore estate, a fund established by Edmund's grandmother that had been administered by a solicitor who charged a considerable fee and produced negligible results. She replaced the solicitor with a direct arrangement, identified 3 specific institutions in the county that could use the funds effectively, and increased the actual charitable output of the trust by 60%, while reducing administrative costs by a third. She wrote up the changes in a clear memorandum and left it on Edmund's desk. He signed it without reading it. He had learned, by November, that whatever Cecily produced was correct, and it was more efficient to sign without reading than to read and sign. He was not wrong about the efficiency. He was wrong about everything the efficiency was costing. She established a reading circle for the wives of the estate tenant farmers, a group that met on Thursday mornings in the village hall. This was unusual. His factor, Mr. Holt, mentioned it to Edmund with a slightly uncertain expression, as though he was not sure whether to present it as a concern or a positive development. Edmund said, "If it causes no difficulty," and returned to the estate papers. It caused no difficulty. It caused, in fact, considerable goodwill among the tenants, who had not previously believed the great house took any interest in them as human beings. She learned, from the estate's head gardener, the specific planting calendar for Hampshire's chalk soil, and applied it to the kitchen garden, which had been producing erratically for years. By February, the kitchen garden was producing, with a consistency that the cook mentioned to Mrs. Denham, who mentioned it to Edmund's valet, who mentioned it to no one because it was not his place. It reached Edmund as a passing remark from his factor. "The gardens are doing well this year, Your Grace." "Good," said Edmund, and signed the next document. At dinner they talked. This was, in its way, the extraordinary thing, because Edmund had not expected to talk to his wife, and found, somewhere in the architecture of obligation, that he was. Not about himself. He was not a man who talked about himself, but about the estate, about political affairs. She had opinions, informed ones, which surprised him and then did not. About books. She had read Wollstonecraft, which surprised him considerably, and then he thought, of course she has. About the tenant situation in the North Field, about the drainage problem on the east boundary, about the correspondence from his cousin Reginald, who continued to write letters that managed, with impressive consistency, to be simultaneously obsequious and threatening. She had thoughts about the cousin. She shared them when asked. She did not share them when not asked. He asked, sometimes. Not enough. Never quite enough. By March, 9 months into the marriage, he was aware that dinner was the part of the day he looked forward to. He had not examined why. He had not examined most things he felt, preferring to operate in the territory of what needed doing rather than what was happening to him. By April, he was aware that when she laughed, which she did at his occasional dry observations, a genuine laugh, not the social performance of amusement, Something in his chest did a thing he had forgotten was possible. He examined this once, briefly, at the end of a long Thursday. He found it alarming. He put it away. He was the Duke of Ashmore. He had put away more difficult things. In May, 11 months into the marriage, Edmund went to his mother's house for tea and made the mistake of mentioning, with the casual tone he used for things he had not examined, that he found Cesaly's management of the household satisfactory. His mother, the Dowager Duchess, a woman of 62, who had outlived 2 husbands and a political era, and had done so by seeing clearly what most people preferred to obscure, set down her teacup. Satisfactory, she repeated. Yes, he said. She is very capable. Edmund, the household accounts have improved considerably, and the charitable trust. Edmund. His mother's voice had the tone she used for his father's name, when his father was being particularly oblivious. Do you know what she did last Thursday? The reading circle. She organized the collection of winter clothing for the families on the east boundary, whose cottages flooded in March. 63 families. She managed it herself, quietly, without asking you for funds, because she found the money within the existing household budget. She did not tell you because she did not expect it to interest you. He was quiet. She did not expect it to interest you, his mother said again, gently. That is what concerns me, Edmund. Not what she is doing. What she has stopped expecting. He drove home from his mother's house in silence. He sat with that sentence, what she has stopped expecting, for the rest of the afternoon in his library, which was where he took things he needed to understand. He went to find her at 5 o'clock. She was in the small sitting room on the first floor, the room she had claimed, quietly, as her own working space, in the way capable people claim spaces through continuous occupation. She was writing letters. The East Boundary families, he said. She looked up. Her expression was neutral, the particular neutrality of someone who has been waiting for a conversation that has taken a long time to arrive. Yes, she said. You didn't tell me. I handled it. There was no need to bring it to you. There was every need. It is my estate. She set down her pen. It is, she said, with a precision that was not accusation, but was not agreement either. Yes. He stood in the doorway of her sitting room, and something about the arrangement of it, him in the doorframe, her at the desk, the familiar distance made him realize, suddenly, and without comfort, that he had been in some version of this arrangement for 11 months, standing at the threshold, never fully entering, never asking what was on the other side of the distance he kept. I should have asked, he said. The words came out differently than he intended without the management he usually applied. She looked at him for a moment. Yes, she said quietly. You should have. He left. He went back to his library. He did not examine the conversation that evening because he did not know, yet, what to do with what he had felt while having it. He would know, 1 month later, when it was too late. Portrait painting in Regency England served a significant social and dynastic function. For a ducal family, a formal portrait of the Duchess was essential. It would hang in the Great Hall, assert the family's continuity, and communicate to the social world that the Duke's choice of wife was worth immortalizing. A Duchess who had not been formally painted within the first year of marriage was conspicuous by the absence. The portrait was, in a sense, the final social confirmation of a marriage, the moment at which the woman was absorbed into the family's visual legacy. It was also, unavoidably, a sitting hours in close proximity with the subject, during which conversation was common, and the usual social armor was somewhat reduced. The portrait was commissioned in June, the 12th month of their marriage, the final week before the Tuesday that ended everything. Edmund had commissioned it from a fashionable London artist named Harlow as a matter of social form. He had arranged it with his secretary. He had told Cecily, in a note left on the breakfast table, that sittings would begin Thursday and that Harlow's studio was on Jermyn Street. He did not attend the first sitting. He had estate business. He attended the second sitting because Harlow sent a note requesting the Duke's presence for the approval of the initial composition. He arrived at the studio expecting to spend 20 minutes, approve the composition, and leave. He stayed for 2 hours, not because the composition required it, because Harlow, who was 60 years old and had been painting portraits of the English aristocracy for 35 years, was talking to Cecily about the specific quality of the afternoon light in Hampshire versus Devon, and Cecily was talking back, animated in a way he had not. He realized, standing in the doorway, seen before, she was animated. She was gesturing slightly with her left hand, which she did not normally do, and her eyes were bright with the particular brightness of someone discussing something they actually cared about. And she was laughing again, the real laugh, not the social one at something Harlow had said about the particular stubbornness of chalk white as a pigment. Edmund stood in the doorway of the studio and watched his wife for approximately 45 seconds before she became aware of his presence. In those 45 seconds, he thought several things rapidly and in sequence. The first, that he had not known she had opinions about light. The second, that she had not told him because he had not asked. The third, and this one, arrived with a velocity that surprised him, that in 12 months of dinners and corridors and the passing geography of shared domestic life, he had never once seen her look the way she looked right now, unguarded, interested, fully present in the room. The fourth, that this was not because she hadn't felt these things. It was because he had never created a space in which it was safe to show them. She noticed him. Her expression composed itself with a speed that hurt him to observe, not coldly, not artificially, but with the particular efficiency of a woman who had learned, over 12 months, that certain versions of herself were not required. "Your Grace," she said. He walked in. He sat down. He looked at the composition. Competent. Correct. Everything a ducal portrait should be. He said nothing about what he had seen in the doorway. He said nothing about any of it. He went home. He sat in his library until midnight. And the next morning, a Tuesday, he said the words. He had told himself it was the right thing. He had told himself this, in various formulations, for approximately 6 weeks, since the evening in May, when his mother said what she has stopped expecting, and he had understood, with the particular cold clarity he applied to difficult estate decisions, that he had done his wife a damage he had not intended. His logic was as follows. Cecily was a capable woman who had been placed in a situation that offered her nothing she had not created herself. She had made the best of a marriage that was, at its foundation, a transaction. She deserved better than a transaction that had run its useful term. She was 25. She had the whole of her adult life ahead, an allowance, the cottage in Devon, her independence. These were generous. These were more than most women in her position received. He had told himself this was kindness. He had told himself, with the particular skill of an intelligent man who has decided something and needs to believe it, that the fact of the matter was that he was doing her a favor. He had not told himself the real reason, because the real reason was not a thing he could manage, and he had been managing things for 12 months, and management was the only mode he knew. The real reason was that he had stood in the doorway of Harlow's studio for 45 seconds and felt something so large and so clarifying that it had frightened him completely. The real reason was that he had gone home and sat in his library and understood that he was not capable, in that moment, or possibly ever, of the kind of person a woman like Cecily deserved to have across the dinner table. The real reason was that it was easier, infinitely easier, the way cowardice is always easier than courage, to release her than to become, in her presence, what she needed. He said it on a Tuesday at breakfast, because Tuesday was an ordinary day, and he needed it to be ordinary. He said it in the flat managing tone because that was the armor he put on before difficult things. She folded her napkin. She set it down. She stood up. It was, in the standing, that he understood. She did not argue. She did not weep. She did not bargain or plead or look at him with the wounded eyes he had. Perhaps, God help him, anticipated the eyes of a woman who could be reassured, redirected, managed back into acceptance. She stood up with the same straight spine she had carried into street. George's church on their wedding day, the same level chin she had brought to the portrait sitting, the same composure she had applied, every day for a year, to a marriage that had asked everything of her and given her a very narrow room in return. She stood up, and she was not performing dignity. She was simply in possession of it, and he understood, in the way understanding arrives, when it is already too late to be useful, that the woman standing up from his breakfast table was not a woman who had been enduring a difficult year. She was a woman who had been, in the most profound sense, present thinking, building, contributing, feeling, being, and he had been in the same house for 12 months, and missed it. Had stood at thresholds and not entered, had signed papers without reading them, had noted things and filed them and looked away. She was not leaving because he had dismissed her. She was leaving because she had learned, over 365 days, that staying meant disappearing, and Cecily Voss, formerly Cecily Hartwell, was not a woman built for disappearing. "I will have Mrs. Denham begin preparations," she said. Her voice was even. She left the breakfast room. He sat at the table for a long time, in the particular silence of a room that has recently contained someone and now does not. In Regency England, a separation of this kind, a duke sending his wife to a secondary property with an allowance, was not divorce. Divorce required an act of parliament, available only on grounds of adultery, at enormous expense, and accessible only to men. What Edmund was arranging was a private separation, a social and domestic arrangement in which husband and wife ceased to cohabit. The wife was provided for at a reduced standard, and the marriage continued to exist, legally, in all its constraints. Cecily would remain his wife under law, unable to remarry, unable to own property independently, unable to appear in court as her own legal person. She would simply do all of this from Devon, in a cottage, without the social life of London, or the household she had been building for a year. This was, under English law, entirely within his rights. The law did not require him to justify it. She had 3 days before the carriage was to leave for Devon. He told himself, during those 3 days, that he was managing the situation with appropriate dignity. He went to his library. He attended to correspondence. He conducted his usual schedule with the precise unremarkability of a man executing a decision already made. He did not speak to her. She was always present in the house, in the corridor, in the dining room where they continued, by some unspoken mutual determination, to take dinner together on the first and second nights. The dinners were quiet, not hostile, simply quiet, the specific quiet of a space from which conversation has been withdrawn, leaving the furniture of habit behind. On the second evening, he refilled her wine glass without being asked, because he always had, and she said thank you, and he said of course, and neither of them said the actual thing, and the dinner concluded. On the third morning he woke at 4 o'clock, with the compound certainty of a man who has arrived, in the dark, at the end of a particular form of self-deception. Are many of you doing there? He lay in the dark of his room and made himself examine it. Actually examine it, not manage it, not file it, not look away. He had spent a year with a woman who was extraordinary and had treated her like a function. He had stood at thresholds because entering required vulnerability, and vulnerability was the thing he had dismantled, piece by careful piece. In the years after his father's death left him with a dukedom and no instruction manual, and the knowledge that he could not afford to fall apart. He had built something very efficient in the place where his capacity for ordinary feeling had been. Cecily had been, for a year, precisely the person who could have helped him rebuild it. He had sent her to Devon. In the dark, at 4 in the morning, he felt the full weight of this, without the armor he usually wore over such things, and it was significant. He got up. He dressed, which he never did himself at 4 in the morning, because the need to do something with his hands was urgent. He went to his library, and he sat there for 2 hours, and he thought not about what to do, because he knew what he needed to do, but about whether he was capable of doing it. He was not certain. He had never been, in 12 months of marriage, actually uncertain. He had been cold, and absent, and efficient, and occasionally wrong, but never uncertain. Now he was, and the uncertainty felt like the first honest thing he had felt in a considerable time. At 6 o'clock he went to find her. She was, of course, working. It was 6 o'clock in the morning on the day she was meant to leave, and she was at her desk in the small sitting room with a candle and a cup of tea, writing letters. He thought, absurdly, in the doorway. How many times has she been in this room while I was in the library? How many parallel hours have we spent 10 feet apart in different rooms? She did not look up when he came in. Mrs. Denham has the Devon inventory, she said. I've left notes on the spring planting schedule, the charitable trust arrangements through December, and the tenant situation in the North Field. Mr. Holt has everything he needs. Cecily, she kept writing. The cook knows the new provisioning arrangements. I've settled the accounts with the linen merchant through August. Cecily. Stop. She stopped. She set down her pen. She did not turn around. He came into the room fully. Not the door frame, not the threshold, but into the room, and sat down in the chair across from her desk. The candle. Between them. I was wrong, he said. She turned. Her expression was not the thing he had been afraid of. It was not hope, which would have been painful, or relief, which would have undone him entirely. It was something more careful than either. The expression of a woman who has learned not to rearrange her expectations in response to a single sentence. What were you wrong about? She said. Not challenging. Requiring precision. He looked at the candle. He had spent 2 hours in his library, and he had not, in those 2 hours, found a prepared answer for this question, which meant he was going to have to find the words without preparation, which was exactly the condition he had been avoiding for 12 months. Everything, he said. Beginning with what I thought this marriage was for, and ending with what I said on Tuesday. She was quiet. You called it a mistake, she said finally. The worst one I have made. Which part? All of it. The year. The way He stopped. He was not a man who groped for language. He had always had language, arranged in orderly formations. Now it was scattered, and he sorted it slowly. I was in the same house as you for 12 months, and I was absent for most of it. Not physically. Present. But the kind of absent that is worse than actual absence, because it occupies the space without filling it. She looked at him for a long time. I know, she said. I know what kind of absent it was. The candle moved in some draft from the window. Why did you stay? He said. For the year. You are not a woman who endures things. You are a woman who acts. Why did you stay, and not say anything? She considered this with the seriousness she applied to things that deserved it. Because I thought, for a long time, that you would find your way to it, she said. People do. Given enough time, and enough. She paused. Enough reason. And then? And then I understood that you weren't going to, without something changing. And nothing was changing. I should have asked you, he said. I should have asked what the 47 meant. In the first week, you were at the breakfast table with the accounts, and I could see you were thinking something, and I read my newspaper. Something in her expression shifted a small crack in the careful composure. You saw the notebook, she said. I saw you. I just didn't look. The room was very quiet. In Regency England, the concept of a wife's happiness within marriage was considered secondary to the concept of a wife's duty. The evangelical movement of the early 19th century had, paradoxically, both elevated women's moral authority within the domestic sphere and restricted their public sphere further. A woman was the moral center of the household, the educator of children, the keeper of virtue, but she was to perform this role in submission to her husband's authority. A wife who openly expressed unhappiness was considered either weak if she wept or dangerous if she argued. The ideal wife was one who transformed her husband's world through influence rather than direct action, who shaped without appearing to shape, who felt deeply but expressed little. This impossible standard produced, in many cases, exactly the silence Edmund encountered. Women who had stopped expecting to be seen because the cost of expecting and being disappointed was too high. She did not tell him it was his fault. She was more precise than that. I am not angry with you, she said. And then, before he could respond, I want you to understand that. It would be easier, in some ways, if I were. Anger is a direction. It tells you where to go and what to address and how to fix the thing. What I actually feel is, she looked for the word with the same care she applied to estate memoranda, tired. I am very tired, Edmund. He heard his own name in her mouth and felt it land differently than he expected. Not of you, she continued. Of being, another careful pause, adjacent. Of being in the room and not in the conversation. Of managing things very well and having the management acknowledged and nothing else acknowledged, of having a mind and a self, and bringing both of them to the table every day, and finding that the table doesn't require them. He did not speak. He understood that this was not the moment for speech. "It is not that you are unkind," she said. "You have never been unkind. You are efficient. You have built something very efficient, and I think you built it because you had to, after your father died, and I think it costs you things you don't know it costs you, and I think—" She stopped. She looked at the candle. "I think if someone had offered you a different way, earlier, you might have found it, but no one did, and you didn't. And I spent a year being very capable inside an arrangement that didn't see me, and I have decided that I cannot continue to do that. Not from Devon, and not from here." Silence. "Unless something changes," she said. He looked at her. "Is that a condition?" He said. "Yes," she said. "I believe it is." For the first time in 12 months, he felt the specific warmth of being required to be exactly himself, rather than the Duke of Ashmore, and discovered that he was not certain who that was. He was going to have to find out. "What would changing look like?" he said. "Specifically." She looked at him steadily. "It would look like you putting down your newspaper," she said. "When I am sitting across the table with something I'm thinking about. It would look like asking what the 47 means. It would look like occasionally entering a room rather than standing in its doorway. It would look like the slightest movement at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile, but the territory adjacent to one, knowing where I am in the house without having to be told." "I always know where you are in the house," he said. She stopped. "I have always known," he said. "Even when I didn't go there. I always knew." The candle moved again. "That," she said quietly, "is what makes this particularly maddening. The entail, or fee-tail, was a legal instrument used by English aristocratic families to keep estates intact across generations by restricting inheritance to specific lines, typically the eldest son, or failing that, the nearest male relative. Breaking an entail required a legal process called a barring of the entail, which required the cooperation of both the current holder and the next heir. If a duke died without a legitimate male heir, the estate passed by the terms of the entail, sometimes to a cousin who had no connection to the estate and no interest in its continuation. This was not merely a legal technicality. It was the reason Edmund had married in the first place. Not for Cesaly, but to prevent Reginald. Reginald Voss arrived at Ashmore House at 9 o'clock on the morning of the day Cecily was supposed to leave for Devon. He was not expected. He was, in fact, spectacularly not expected. Edmund was still in the small sitting room, having spent 45 minutes in the most honest conversation he had ever had with another person, and having arrived, at the end of it, at a tentative and fragile understanding with his wife that the carriage might be delayed. The tentative and fragile understanding was interrupted by the footman, announcing that Mr. Reginald Voss had arrived and was in the entrance hall and would not be told to wait. Edmund's expression when he heard this was a thing Cecily observed carefully and filed for later examination. "Your cousin," she said. "Yes, the one who wants the silver collection, among other things." He stood. She stood. They went downstairs. Reginald Voss was 43, broad, and had the particular quality of a man who had been expecting his cousin to die without an heir for 2 decades and had furnished his expectations accordingly. He stood in the entrance hall with a confidence that was already beginning to revise itself as he observed the joint descent of the Duke and Duchess from the upper landing. The joint descent was not something he had planned for. "Edmund," he said, with the heartiness of a man buying time to think. "And the Duchess. I didn't know you'd be leaving?" Cecily said pleasantly. "I was just on my way." Reginald's eyes moved between them with the rapid calculation of a man reading a situation. "I came to discuss the Hampshire matter," he said. "The Northfield drainage question. I understand you've been having some difficulty with the boundary." "No difficulty," Edmund said. "But I had a letter from Holt." "Mr. Holt wrote to you?" Cecily said. A beat. Something shifted in the entrance hall. Cecily looked at Edmund. "I believe your cousin has been corresponding with your factor about the estate management," she said, in the tone of someone reporting a finding, rather than making an accusation. "Is that so?" Edmund said. It was entirely friendly, Reginald said quickly. Simply keeping informed. Of the Northfield drainage, Edmund said. Among other? Reginald. The name landed with a weight that cleared the entrance hall of pretense, the way a window clears a room of smoke. Reginald stopped. My wife, Edmund said, with a precision he had not known, until this moment, that he possessed, is not going anywhere. My household is not available for correspondence with secondary interested parties, and the Northfield drainage has been resolved. Mrs. Voss. He used her correct title deliberately, addressed it in February. Reginald looked at Cecily. Cecily looked back with the expression of a woman who knows exactly what is happening and has decided to let it happen. I see, said Reginald, in the voice of a man revising a plan he had spent considerable time on. I expect you do, said Edmund. Carver will write to you about the entail question. Good morning. Reginald left. The entrance hall was quiet. Edmund stood where he was for a moment. Then he turned to Cecily. The factor, he said, has apparently been keeping Reginald informed since at least January. She said, I noticed some irregularities in the correspondence copybook 3 months ago. I did not, bring it to you. I handled it myself, or I thought I had. Edmund looked at her. You knew, he said. About Reginald and Holt. I suspected. I was gathering evidence before presenting it, and if you had gone to Devon, she was quiet for a moment. Then Reginald would have been considerably more confident by autumn. The weight of this sat between them not as accusation, but as a fact, plain and significant. You were protecting the estate, he said slowly, even while you were leaving it. It is a good estate, she said. It deserves to be well managed. He looked at her. She looked at him. Cancel the carriage, he said. She waited 1 beat. Then, not until we finished the conversation we were having. He almost laughed. The near laugh was, in its way, the most genuine thing he had managed in 12 months. The conversation is not finished? You have established that you always knew where I was in the house, she said. That is a beginning. It is not a conclusion. They walked. He had suggested it another thing he didn't do, because he was not a man who walked to think. But she was, as he had observed. And he was trying now to be the person who observed and then acted on the observation. The June morning was warm. The garden was, as he had noted and not remarked upon 11 months ago, beautiful in season. She walked the way she did everything, with purpose, but without hurry. He matched her pace, which required a slight adjustment, because he was naturally faster, and the adjustment was a small thing, and at the same time not small. Tell me about Wollstonecraft, he said. She looked at him sideways. You want to talk about Wollstonecraft? You've read her. I haven't read her in 4 years. And you have opinions about her. I can tell because you have opinions about everything, and you have not yet shared them about this, which means either you don't trust me with them, or you assumed I didn't want to hear them. The latter, she said, without drama. Tell me. She looked at him for another moment. Then she told him. She talked for 20 minutes, the way she had talked to Harlow about light, with the brightness of someone who has been holding something back and is being asked, for the first time, to put it down. She talked about the vindication, and about what it said about education, and about what education meant for women in a society that simultaneously expected them to manage considerable complexity and denied them the tools to do it, formally. She talked about the charitable trust and the reading circle and the tenant farmers' wives who had said last Thursday that they had never been asked their opinion about anything before and had found it, unexpectedly, quite difficult to form one, which she believed was the system's most damaging effect. He listened. He asked 2 questions, and both of them were the right questions she could tell, because both produced answers she had not considered saying aloud before, and found, saying them, that they were exactly what she had been thinking. The 47, he said, when she had paused. She blinked. In the first week. The notebook. You had written 47 and the word irregular. What was it? She stopped walking. She looked at him with an expression that moved through several stages in a short time, surprise, and something more complicated behind it. The linen merchant had been overcharging the household for 18 months, she said. £47 accumulated. And you corrected it. I did. Without telling me. You were reading your newspaper. I was reading my newspaper, he agreed. And you solved it anyway. And I didn't ask. She was looking at him with the gray eyes that had assessed him at the engagement dinner, and had been, ever since, quietly and accurately reading him. You are doing something, she said, slowly. I am trying to understand the year. You are asking questions, she said. You are asking questions you already know the answers to, because you want me to know that you know them. He said nothing. You saw the notebook in the first week, she said. It was not a question. Yes. You saw me in the portrait sitting. Yes. And you saw the East Boundary collection, and the reading circle, and the spring planting. Yes. You saw all of it. I saw all of it, he said. I saw it, and I filed it away, and I did not enter the room. Because entering the room required something I had. He stopped. He made himself finish it, out here in the June garden where there was no library to retreat to, dismantled. Over time. After my father died, because dismantling it was the only way to do what needed doing. She was very still. And now? She said. Now I think the dukedom will survive me learning to put it back together, he said. If you are willing to, if you would. He was not a man who stumbled over language, and he was stumbling now, and he made himself continue in the stumbling. Stay. And tell me when I go back to the newspaper, and put 47 in the notebook, and show me what it is. She looked at the garden for a long moment. The June light was warm. A bird was making a determined argument somewhere in the roses. The north field was visible in the distance, and it was, he thought, doing well. Cancel the carriage, she said. He exhaled. Yes, he said. The concept of a companionate marriage, a marriage based on mutual affection, intellectual partnership, and genuine friendship between spouses, was gaining cultural traction in the early 19th century. Promoted by writers, including Mary Wollstonecraft, and, later, John Stuart Mill. It was, however, far from the norm. Most aristocratic marriages remained fundamentally transactional. The companionate ideal was aspirational, literary, and largely the province of the middle classes. For a duke to restructure his marriage around his wife's intellectual partnership was unusual enough to attract comment. Most people assumed it was temporary. Some of them were wrong. The December account books were the best the Ashmore estate had produced in 11 years. Edmund knew this because he had read them, not signed them, read them, with the notebook open beside him and a pencil in his hand for questions, of which he had 3, all of them productive. He had found Cecily in the sitting room. He had entered the sitting room. He had sat down across from her desk and put the account books on the table between them and said, "These 2 numbers don't reconcile. Walk me through it." She had looked at him with the expression she had that was not quite a smile, but contained one. She walked him through it. It took 40 minutes, and was the most useful 40 minutes he had spent all week. At the end of it, he understood the Southfield yield discrepancy, the projected spring expenditure on the Northwood maintenance, and the specific way the charitable trust's new arrangement was creating a secondary economic benefit in the village that neither of them had predicted, but both of them found satisfying. He understood these things because she had explained them, and because he had asked questions, and because the questions had been the right ones, finally, or close enough to right ones that she had helped him to the correct ones. And the space between them was no longer the space of 2 people managing parallel existences, but something smaller and warmer and considerably more complicated and entirely right. Reginald's solicitor had written, in October, to inquire about the entail. Edmund had written back, through his own solicitor, to indicate that the question of the entail's continued necessity was under review in light of the Duchess's confirmed good health and the expected continuance of the marriage in its current. He had paused over the word, productive form. The solicitor had relayed this to Reginald. Reginald had apparently sat down rather suddenly. Holt, the factor, had been let go in July. His replacement was a man from Somerset, who had been recommended by the Duchess, and who had, in his first 3 months, identified 2 other inefficiencies that no one had caught, and whose reports were models of clarity. Edmund read them. He had begun, in general, to read things, which was a development Mrs. Denham had noted to the cook, and the cook had noted to the gardener, and the gardener had decided was generally a good sign. On the evening of the 15th of December, Edmund came to find Cecily in the sitting room at 5 o'clock their time. Now, in the way times become yours, when two people agree, without saying so, to be available at them. She was not writing letters. She was reading the Wollstonecraft, which she was rereading in light of a pamphlet she had obtained from a reforming society in London, and which she had left on his desk the previous week, with a note suggesting he might find it interesting. He had found it interesting. He had left his own annotation on it, a question in pencil in the margin beside a paragraph about education. She had answered it in a different pencil, smaller. He had replied. The pamphlet had spent 4 days traveling between their desks, and was now covered in the conversation they had conducted around and through it. He sat down. He had a letter in his hand. "From the Somerset Reading Society," he said. "Responding to your application for the Ashmore estate tenants. They have agreed to supply materials." She looked up. "You wrote back to them?" "Your letter was on the desk. I added a paragraph. I thought a ducal signature might be useful." She looked at him for a moment with the gray eyes and the expression that was not quite a smile but had been, over 6 months, expanding its territory. "Did you read my letter before adding the paragraph?" She said. "Yes. And? It was excellent," he said. "You have a very clear style. I told them so." She did smile, then fully, without the managing of it, the way she had laughed in Harlow's studio, and he had seen, for the first time, what she looked like when she wasn't holding something back. He thought, that is what changing looks like. Not a single moment. Not a declaration, or a grand gesture, or a reversal of fortune. It looks like reading a letter before signing it. It looks like a pencil, in a margin. It looks like 5 o'clock in December in a sitting room where the fire is warm, finding the same person there every time, and remembering, belatedly and not without cost, to be glad of it. "You should have read the accounts in January," she said. "I know." The 47 would have been a very good starting conversation. The best. She reached across the desk and retrieved the annotated pamphlet. "There's a second question I want to put in the margin," she said. "It's about the passage on property rights for women. I want to know what you think." "I think," he said carefully, because he had thought about it, "that the legal argument is more straightforward than Wollstonecraft allows, and that the practical obstacle is entirely different from the legal one, and that your reading circle is already addressing the practical obstacle more directly than any pamphlet." She looked at him. She put the second question in the margin. She handed him the pamphlet. He answered it. Outside, the December dark had come down over Hampshire, and the estate was quiet and whole, and the north field was resting through its winter, and the kitchen garden was dormant but ready, and somewhere in the great house, the fire in the library was lit, as it always was, and the Duke of Ashmore was in the sitting room instead, which was where the conversation was. Edmund and Cecily Voss are fictional. The world they inhabit is not. In Regency England, the marriage of convenience was not a romantic cliché. It was a legal and social instrument with real consequences for real people, most of whom had no recourse when the instrument failed them. A duchess who found herself in Cecily's position, capable, invisible, emotionally uninhabited by a husband who meant no harm and caused it anyway, had no legal remedy, no social support, and no vocabulary for what was happening to her beyond the period's limited and inadequate language of female complaint. The women who thrived in these conditions did what Cesaly did. They built what they could within the walls available. They kept records. They organized reading circles and tenant networks and charitable trusts and household accounts, and they waited for someone to ask what the 47 meant. Some of them were asked. Most were not. The Married Women's Property Act of 1870 gave women the first legal right to own property after marriage. The concept that a wife's happiness was a relevant consideration in marriage, not merely her function, would take longer to become law, and longer still to become practice. The conversation in the margin is not a small thing. It is what the whole of it, all the centuries of it, was always actually about. If this story reached you, kindly click the subscribe button and share this story. Thank you so much. And if you found yourself holding your breath somewhere in the sitting room at 6 in the morning, or in the portrait studio doorway, or at the breakfast table on a Tuesday? I want to know. Tell me in the comments where you were listening from. And if you know someone who needs to hear a story about what it costs to not look, share it. These stories matter. Every single one of them.